Now to Bucks County, where officials say they've solved the decades-old cold case murder of a young girl.
Yeah, today officials detailing their thorough investigation that ultimately led them to the suspect after 63 years. 9-year-old Carol Ann Doherty was found murdered at St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church in Bristol in October of 1962.
On the evening of October 22, 1962, a father walked into St. Mark's Catholic Church in Bristol, Pennsylvania, looking for his 9-year-old daughter. She had left home that afternoon on her bicycle to return library books and had not come back. He found her on the landing leading to the choir loft, sexually assaulted, strangled with a ligature, a sock stuffed in her mouth. She had stopped to pray on her way past, as she always did. Her bicycle was outside. Her library books were on the floor. He had left something behind, too. As she fought, she tore a few of his hairs loose, and they stayed in her hand. For decades, that evidence pointed to one man it could never quite hold. He was long gone from the state. Another child died before the case closed. His name had been in the case file since January 1963. This is how they finally found the monster. Her name was Carol Ann Doherty. She was 9 years old, a fifth-grade student at the parish school attached to St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church in Bristol Borough, Bucks County. Her parents were Frank and Dorothy Doherty. She had a younger sister named Kay, who was not yet 3. Carol Ann was an avid reader who loved mystery books in particular, the kind a fifth-grader could finish in an afternoon. She checked them out from the Bristol Borough Free Library, read them at home, and brought them back for more. She had a habit her family knew well. Whenever she passed St. Mark's Church, she went inside to say a prayer. It did not matter if she was on her way to the library, the store, or a friend's house. The church was part of her route the way the library was. She stopped at both. One was where she returned books. The other was where she talked to God. On the afternoon of October 22, 1962, Carol Ann left her home on her bicycle. She was heading to the library to return mystery books and meet 2 friends. She stopped at Tommy's on Farragut Avenue for a Coke and penny candy, then rode down Lincoln Avenue toward the church. A block and a half from St. Mark's on Lincoln Avenue lived a man who was not at work that day. Carol Ann's route to the church took her along his street. Police later placed the attack at around 3:35 that afternoon on the choir loft landing. She had fought back hard enough to tear hair from her attacker's body, and it stayed clutched in her hand. Whoever did it left 2 things behind: the hairs she had pulled loose and a few Lucky Strike cigarette butts. Her 2 friends were outside the church when it happened, waiting for her. By 4:30, Carol Ann had not come home. Frank and Dorothy Doherty began searching, checking the library and the homes of friends. They drove the route she would have taken on her bicycle. Around 6 o'clock that evening, Dorothy spotted Carol Ann's bicycle parked outside St. Mark's Church and told her husband to look inside. Frank walked through the doors and into the church. He found his daughter in the choir loft, under a stained glass window. He came back out to the car. Kay later remembered the inhuman noises her father made when he opened the car door and told her mother not to go inside the church. She was not yet 3 years old, and the sound of her father's voice that evening became her first clear memory of him. He called the police from a phone near the church. Bristol Borough officers and detectives from the Bucks County District Attorney's Office responded to the scene. The chief of police was Vincent Faragalli, 44 years old, a widower with 3 daughters of his own. He led the investigation from the first hour. His team worked the church through the night and bagged everything the killer had left behind. By morning, the canvassing began. Detectives went block by block, looking for anyone who had seen something that afternoon. A man near the door, a person leaving around 3:30, anyone who did not belong inside St. Mark's. The murder of a 9-year-old girl inside a Catholic church produced immediate outrage in Bristol Borough. The town was small, a working-class community along the Delaware River, 20 miles northeast of Philadelphia. Newspapers ran photographs of her body being carried down the church steps on a gurney covered in a white sheet. Everyone knew the Doherty family. Everyone knew St. Mark's. The shock of it stayed in local memory for generations. A 7-year-old boy named Mike Missinelli was playing football in his yard with his brother that evening when his mother came running out of the house. Chief Faragali had called her. He had told her there had been a murder in the neighborhood and to get her children inside. Faragali was her brother-in-law. 62 years later, Missinelli made a podcast about the case as a tribute to his uncle, who never once discussed it. Faragali kept a photograph of Carol Ann on his desk at the Bristol Police Department for the next 17 years. He never spoke about the case with his 3 daughters. The biggest failure of his career was something he carried alone. Detectives investigated 4 men in the weeks that followed. The first was Frank Zucchero, an aging handyman who was known around Bristol as the town drunk. He had a low IQ, English was not his first language, and he had a record of exposing himself to little girls. He was brought in for questioning, and after hours of interrogation, he confessed. Within 24 hours, he recanted. Faragali determined the confession had been coerced and dismissed him as a suspect. The second was Wayne Roach, a 19-year-old whose own parents called police after they found Carol Ann's name written in his notebook. Detectives investigated him and cleared him. Then there was Father Joseph Sabadish, a parish priest at St. Mark's. His alibi for the time of the murder turned out to be a lie. Investigators eventually confirmed that Sabadish had been at a store in Whomville Borough buying lingerie for a married woman he was pursuing. He had also been secretly recorded threatening to sexually assault 2 women in separate incidents. He passed a polygraph for the Doherty murder and was eliminated. What followed was the perfect storm. 3 of the 4 suspects investigated in the first months had documented sexual deviance, false alibis, or confessions that fell apart. The volume of bad leads gave the real killer cover. The 4th suspect was the man on Lincoln Avenue. He came to the attention of police about 2 months after the murder, when a neighbor called to report that he had been acting strangely and had cut through their yard near the church the day Carol Ann was killed. Other witnesses had described a man with a scar nearby that afternoon, someone who, as one of them put it, looked like he had just done something terrible. He had a scar on his face and worked at a tool factory in town. In January 1963, detectives brought him in. He told them he had been at work the day of the murder. His time cards showed he had not worked for 3 consecutive days, including October 22nd. He was lying. Detectives took a pubic hair sample from him and put him on a polygraph, and he failed it. Within weeks of the interview, he was gone. He went to Florida first, then drifted through Texas, and finally landed in Houma, Louisiana, 1,000 miles from the choir loft. His name went into the file. Subscribe so you don't miss how they finally proved it was him. Over the following decades, investigators collected pubic hair samples from 176 men connected to the case or the area. 141 of those samples were tested through microscopic analysis, the only forensic comparison available at the time. Every single man was eliminated as a possible source of the hairs in Carol Ann's hand. Every man except one. His sample showed what analysts described as significant similarities to the hairs clutched in a 9-year-old girl's fist. The evidence pointed at one person, but pointing was not proving. Microscopic comparison could narrow a field. It could not make a definitive identification the way DNA later could. By the time DNA had become the standard for hair forensics in the 1990s, the Doherty hairs had been combed and stored for 30 years and were already degrading. No laboratory in the world could read a sample that far gone. The case had a suspect it could not charge and physical evidence it could not make conclusive. In the autumn of 1992, a reporter at the Bucks County Courier-Times named J.D. Mullane began going through the Doherty case file for a 30th anniversary series. He wrote a 3-part piece called Murder in a Choir Loft. It pulled the case back into public memory. The Bucks County District Attorney at the time, Alan Rubenstein, read it. So did the Pennsylvania State Police. They ran the hair comparison again. The result held the same suspect from January 1960 was still the one sample no one could rule out. In 1994, Bucks County extradited him from Louisiana, where he was already serving a sentence for another crime. A grand jury convened, and 2 men were called before it. Father Joseph Sabadish, the priest who had lied about his alibi, and the man with the scar who had lied about his timecards 31 years earlier. Sabadish testified. Frank Doherty testified. The factory worker invoked his Fifth Amendment right and refused to answer questions. Both men passed a polygraph this time around. Neither was indicted. He was sent back to Louisiana to finish his sentence in another state's prison. He had been extradited across state lines. He had stood before a grand jury convened to charge him with killing a child in a church. And he had walked. Frank and Dorothy Doherty carried their daughter's murder for the rest of their lives. Frank was the one who found her. He had walked into the church looking for a child who was late for dinner. What he walked back out with, he never put down. In 1994, Frank sat in front of the grand jury and told them what he knew. It was the closest the system ever brought him to the man who had done it. Both parents were gone before the answer came. Kay was not yet 3 in 1962. She grew up inside the silence, in a family that did not talk about what had happened, a house shaped around the sister she never got to know. She would be the only one of the 4 Dohertys still alive when the name finally came. Carol Ann would have been 19 in 1972, 29 in 1982, 39 in 1992. By the time a grand jury named her killer, she would have been 72. The answer was a block and a half away the whole time, and no one could prove it. In 2007, 5 years after the man from Lincoln Avenue died in a Louisiana prison, his stepson walked into a parole office in Houma and asked to speak with the officer on duty. His name was Robert LeBlanc. The officer's name was William Null. LeBlanc told the officer that his stepfather had confessed to a murder in Pennsylvania before he died. A little girl killed in a church, a crime the old man had called the perfect murder. For more than 40 years, no one had ever connected him to it. Null wrote it down. He sent the letter to Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The letter went into the file of a detective who did nothing with it, and when he retired, the file went with him. A confession from the only suspect whose hair could not be excluded, written down by a Louisiana parole officer and mailed to the agency that had failed to indict him in 1994, sat in a desk drawer in Bucks County. It stayed there for over a decade. By the time anyone read it again, the man who had given his stepson the confession had been dead for nearly 20 years. On Halloween night in 1970, 8 years after killing Carol Ann, the suspect from Bristol got into a dispute with his wife in Houma. During the argument, he told her that if she was still in the house when he got back, he would set it on fire. About 2 hours before the fire started, he bought a small amount of gasoline. Later that night, he did. A 12-year-old girl named Catherine Marie Smith was inside the house, staying over with his stepdaughter for Halloween. Catherine died in the fire. His stepdaughter was left with permanent brain damage, and his wife was hospitalized but survived. State and city fire investigators in 1970 could not determine the cause of the blaze. The case sat for 15 years. In 1985, the state of Louisiana revisited the original investigation, inspected the preserved site, and arrested him for first-degree murder. A grand jury charged him. A jury returned a manslaughter verdict in June 1986. He was sentenced to 21 years at hard labor, the maximum penalty for the lesser charge. What had finally moved the case was a witness who had been 13 years old in 1970. Catherine's older sister Judy had been at a family gathering that Halloween night. She had heard him threaten to set the house on fire if his wife was still there on his return. She did not tell anyone outside the family. Nobody asked her until 15 years later, when investigators finally went back to the people who had been in the room. He served the sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. The 1994 grand jury trip to Pennsylvania was a brief interruption. He was still inside on the morning he died of a heart attack in July 2002. He had caused the deaths of 2 children in 2 states and never answered to a jury for either of them as a murderer. In the early 2020s, Bucks County Detective Lieutenant Timothy Perkins reopened the Doherty case. He went back to page 1. Every report, every interview transcript, every line in the file. 6 decades of work needed to be reread. From the first witness statements taken the night of October 22nd, 1962, to the last entry in the file. Perkins worked with Pennsylvania State Police Troopers Jordan Rhodes, Christopher Cleveland, and David Baer from the Criminal Investigations Unit. Perkins started with the records. In the files of a retired detective, he found the letter from 2007. He pulled it. He added it to the active case. The confession had been sitting in a Bucks County police building for the better part of a generation. He sent the original pubic hair samples to Othram, the Texas lab that handles degraded forensic material from older cases. It was a long shot, and the prosecutors said so out loud before the results came back. The samples had been stored for 60 years in evidence boxes that had moved between locations, including a stretch in the attic of a municipal building that went unheated through Pennsylvania winters. The lab could not pull a usable profile. The one piece of physical evidence that pointed at a single man was too far gone to finish the job. He went to Louisiana anyway. In November 2024, Perkins and the state police troopers sat down with Robert LeBlanc in Houma. LeBlanc was older now and had lived with what his stepfather had told him for over 30 years. He told the investigators the story again, in person, from the beginning. According to LeBlanc, his stepfather had spoken about it twice. Once in 1994, around the time of the Pennsylvania grand jury, once shortly before he died. Both times the story was the same. He had lured a little girl into a church in Bristol. He had attacked her. He had killed her so she could not tell anyone. LeBlanc had no prior knowledge of the case. He had never seen the file, never read a news clipping. Yet he described the church, the choir loft, the way she was killed. Those details could only have come from someone who was there that afternoon, or from the man who told him. Investigators assessed his account as highly credible. The location matched. The timing matched. The age of the victim matched. The specific physical evidence matched. They went back over his statements more than once, and each time he was consistent. 6 decades after fleeing Bristol, the man had told his stepson exactly what he had done and why. Robert LeBlanc died not long after the November 2024 interview. Whatever he had been carrying for 30 years was finally on the record. He had told it first to a parole officer in 2007, who wrote it down in a letter no one read. Then, for reasons he never fully explained, he waited again. Almost 2 more decades until investigators came to him. He told it a second time, in person, and then he was gone. The story outlived both the man who did it and the man who carried it. His name was William Schrader. In October 1962, Schrader had been 24 years old, a factory worker who lived on Lincoln Avenue with relatives. The grand jury report laid out a life of violence going back to childhood. He had grown up in Luzerne County, near Wilkes-Barre. At 8, he was stomping on the feet of girls at school. At 12, he was punching little girls in the mouth without provocation. At 15, he stole a car. At 17, he joined the army. At 18, he was dishonorably discharged. At 20, he was arrested for shooting a man in Luzerne County and convicted of attempted murder. He served time at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. He was 23 when he walked out. When he was released, he moved to Bristol Borough, where his brother and sister-in-law were already living. He got a job at the Century Tool Company. He found a house down the street from St. Mark's, a Catholic church with a parish school full of children. After fleeing Pennsylvania, he married a woman in Louisiana with children. The grand jury report listed 7 documented sexual assaults, pre-adolescent girls or women with cognitive disabilities who could not defend themselves. his stepdaughters, 2 foster children, his own biological daughter, his granddaughters, 2 adult women. The ages of his victims ranged from 6 to 13. The pattern did not stop. It continued across decades, across generations of his own family, across every female child who came within his reach. From the girls in his Luzerne County schoolyard to his own granddaughters, it ran for more than 50 years. It did not stop until the day he died. On October 29, 2025, 63 years and 1 day after Carol Ann was killed, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Shorn stood at a podium in Doylestown and announced the results of the reinvestigation. The 53-page report of the Bucks County Investigating Grand Jury, approved on October 27th by President Judge Raymond F. McHugh, formally found that William Schrader had committed the sexual assault and murder of Carol Ann Doherty. Shorn said her office believed it was the only documented case of a child being sexually assaulted and killed inside a Catholic church in the United States. 1 of 1. And the man who had done it had been on the case file in Bristol Borough for 63 years. The finding rested on everything the case had accumulated since 1962. The physical evidence that singled him out and no one else. The lies he told in 1963, the grand jury he walked out of in 1994, and what he had finally said out loud to family in the years before he died. A clinical and forensic psychologist named Dr. Veronique Valliere testified before the grand jury. She described Schrader as a psychopath with a deviant sexual arousal for prepubescent victims, impulsive, comfortable with high-risk crimes. She also explained the thing that finally undid him. A man like this often wants to share what he did. The control, the getting away with it, the pride in it. That need to brag outweighs the instinct to stay quiet. Sooner or later, she said, a man like that says too much to the wrong person. The pattern in her testimony matched the pattern in the file. The grand jury approved charges against him: murder, robbery, theft, abuse of a corpse. There was no one left to arrest. The case was closed as what the law calls an exception: death of the offender. Pennsylvania State Police Captain Seth Kelly, whose troop covered Bucks County, said the investigation had stayed a priority through every change of personnel and every passing decade. Kay Talanka stood next to the district attorney and spoke about her sister. She thanked J.D. Mullane, the reporter who had been writing about the case for 33 years. She thanked Mike Missinelli, the boy from the football game, now grown. She said her family had lived without answers, and the uncertainty had become a shadow that touched every day of their lives. She said her parents had died without the answer on this earth. She said she had never expected to see this day, that she had carried the not knowing most of her life. Now, at last, she had a name. A 9-year-old girl rode her bicycle to return library books on an October afternoon. She stopped at a church to pray. The man who followed her inside told his stepson 30 years later that he had committed the perfect murder. 63 years and 1 day after that afternoon,